Hi, and welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is our show that we conduct every other week, where we take a look at some of the research of our center directors and provide you with the insight and analysis you need. And it's valuable to you to act upon that information and to let your friends, neighbors, and others know what's happening in our state. This week, we'll be looking at the analysis that Todd Myers provided on the salmon returns, and specifically how some reports on salmon returns haven't actually lived up to the best of standards. We'll take a look at that, and we'll take a look at the income tax amicus brief that is filed by Washington Policy Center in the case against the state income tax on capital gains. We'll do that with Chris Corry after we speak with Todd. Before we get into our guests, though, while we give people some time to join the program, I did want to point to our website, washingtonpolicy.org, where Mark Harmsworth has a new blog up about I-405 tolling, where the state is planning to increase I-405 tolls up to $8,640 a year and toll the weekends as well. It's just a devastating piece about how the state, which originally, remember, was supposed to be making money off the tolls in order to create more capacity or better capacity, how this experiment has gone awry, and some of the problems with how our state manages transportation generally. But you take a look at what some of these proposals are, and then try to think about how affordable they would be for people. And I use the term affordable very loosely, mostly to mean unaffordable, how they would impact people on the 405 corridor. And it just shows you the seriousness and the importance of paying attention to policy, because policy matters. It impacts your life. It impacts, the congestion along the roadways, how long you're going to be able to be with your family, with your kids, and what kind of job mobility you're going to have, whether or not you're going to be able to move from one job to the other, or where you can live, realistically speaking, if you're going to take a job in a certain area. So it's just a reminder of the impact and the reason for Washington Policy Center, and why we take policy seriously and believe that good policy helps improve lives. And that's why we advocate for free market reforms and market-based policies, and efficiency and accountability in government. We want to bring Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, on the show right now. Todd has been taking a look at some of the reporting specifically on salmon recovery issues. And it was really interesting to me because, as is not uncommon on this program, when Todd takes a look at what's happening in the media versus what's happening in reality, you get two different things. You can either follow the science or follow the reporting, I guess, is how it works. Todd, why don't you explain some of the problems that you've had with the reporting of late on the salmon recovery, specifically along the Elwha?
Yeah, so there was an article in the Seattle Times recently by Linda Mapes, who is the Seattle Times sort of primary environmental reporter. She actually wrote a book about destroying the Elwha dams a decade ago. And so she has covered this from time to time, often proclaiming how great things are going. Several articles about how it's coming back faster than expected. She wrote a piece a few years ago that salmon were surging back, particularly Chinook, were surging back. And so she wrote another one last week about how the first coho fishery was occurring on the Elwha. So the tribes and others have basically had a ban on fishing in the Elwha to help facilitate recovery of the fishery. And so this time, for the first year, they were able to catch a very limited number of coho on the Elwha. So this is great news, right? We have a lot of challenges with salmon in Puget Sound and Washington State generally. So the fact that a fishery that had been closed for a very long time is now open, even in a limited way, is great. It's not surprising. We know that opening up habitat upstream is good for salmon like coho, smaller salmon, which is why we are working on removing fish barriers like culverts and things like that don't allow fish passage upstream. The Elwha dams were basically just giant barriers, blocking off lots and lots of habitat upstream. So it's not surprising that a decade after the dams came down, you're starting to see the benefit for coho. It's a little bit slower than they had wanted, but nonetheless, it's good news. There's a little bit of a go ahead.
You no, I was going to ask. There was some discrepancy because for people who say, hey, look, we should tear down the lower Snake River dams. Right. One of the things that you've been pointing to is the Elwha dams do not make that case. And now with this, this little bit of good news that you're talking about, even though it's delayed, does that mean that the people who want to tear down the lower Snake River dams can now point to this and say, hey, look, we have a bit of a case here?
So the Elwha dams are completely different from the Snake River dams, right? The Elwha dams blocked off all of the habitat, whereas with the Snake River dams, that's not true. Fish easily get past the Snake River dams. Between 96 and 98% of the smolt get past the dams going downstream. So it's just completely different scenario, but people treat dams as if they're dams. The other thing is that you often hear, and in fact, NOAA Fisheries, well, I shouldn't say NOAA Fisheries, the political leadership of NOAA Fisheries have cited the so-called success of the Elwha as evidence that removing the Snake River dams would help. You don't hear the local NOAA experts saying that. You hear the Washington, D.C. political leaders saying that. And here's the reason, which is that the results for Chinook on the Elwha have not been nearly as good. So Linda Mapes, the author of the article talking about the coho, also mentioned that Chinook are doing better. And she said that the 2022 returns of 3,998 was double the pre-dam levels for Chinook. Where she got that number was from a report about the 2022 numbers that shows counts going back to 1985. There are some really big problems with that claim. The first is that since the dams came down, which was a little bit before, but basically since the dams came down, the way they have counted fish on the Elwha is using sonar. So it's a much more accurate way, and it also produces higher numbers than the previous method. The previous method before the dams were taken down is that researchers would go out and they would count what are called REDs, REDD, which is just basically a salmon nest. So they would see the salmon nest. You can identify them because the female fish creates a little area, a little indentation to lay the eggs, and you can see this area that has been disturbed in the river, and so you can count those. And then they multiplied by 2.5 and added a little bit the number of fish that were removed below. The problem is those are two very different ways of counting. And in the report itself, it says that the RED method of counting produces numbers that are about 22% lower than the sonar. So you can't compare before and after and then say, oh, see, there are more Chinook now than there were before because the counting system has changed. The second indication that that is the case is that in 2013, 14, and 15, which were Chinook returns right after the dams had been removed. So fish that had been, laid and then left when the dams were still in place and spent then their life at ocean and only came back when the dams had been removed. Very little benefit to them. All three of those years, 2013, 2014, and 2015, there were higher Chinook numbers than there were in 2022. So why would it be that, almost a decade after the dams had been removed, populations would be up, but populations that were right after the dams were removed and basically didn't have time to benefit from it would be higher than 2022. So the claim that Chinook are returning, that their levels are double what they were before dam removal is based on data that is probably incorrect, well, certainly incorrect, and is also lower than they were right after the dam was removed when there was no benefit. So it is a stretching, right? I mean, Linda has long been an advocate of removing the LWA dams. This is not about removing the LWA dams. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't have been removed. The key, though, is like what works, what is effective and what is not, and declaring success when we still have a moratorium on Chinook harvesting, one that they thought would be eliminated after 5 years, and still here we are almost a decade and it's still not removed, indicates that it's not having the benefit that they expected. And so playing with the numbers for political purposes so that you can then say, oh, it's working so great here, therefore we should do the same thing to Snake River dams, is just unscientific, and it's bad, leads to bad policy. It leads us to believe that we should do things that don't work. And that's, look, we're not recovering Chinook in Puget Sound. And if we, pretend that things are working when they're not, well, we're going to put our resources in the wrong places and we're not going to get recovery. And that's just wrong. I mean, I just think that that's not only unethical, it's ineffective.
It's got to be frustrating for you because I feel like I have, whenever I have you on or we're talking about something, this is a strongly recurring theme that data is either misused, cherry picked, or some obvious patterns are missed on reporting. And then, it's not always the same reporter necessarily, but still the pattern is pretty dominant. And then if you point them out, like I'm guessing that you probably sent a corrective letter saying you're missing the point here, and here. And there's just rarely a correction to such things or a course change in how they report such things. And like you say, how are you supposed to make policy better if you're in denial about what the data actually is? It's like trying to coach if you're trying to coach somebody in track and you're using a faulty stopwatch or starting it before they're actually running or just not keeping accurate times, you're not actually helping them achieve anything. But when it comes to state policy, there seems to be a pattern and a revelry in kind of rejoicing in false data or misused data so that they can create policies that don't actually work. I mean, it's a weird situation in many ways.
Well, and what you hear all the time is people saying, follow the science. But then, right, when the data are there and the report itself says, look, don't compare these numbers to these numbers because they are different. They use, right, these are less accurate and they are lower, and these are more accurate and are higher. Don't compare them. And then you see people specifically comparing them. I just think it's irresponsible. Now, I don't know whether she read the full report and saw that and just ignored it, or whether she just took the data from the appendix and then decided to run with that. Either way, I think that the data are not reflective of what is, or the data or the argument that she made is not reflective of the actual data in that report.
I want to remind folks, if you have a question at any point during any of our interviews, just go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type in your question, and we'll try and get to it during our conversations. We have one individual writing, asking about one of the big selling points of taking down the Elwha Dam was recreational dollars that were supposed to dramatically jump, but that didn't happen. Which they also claim about the Lower Snake River dams. Do you know, is there any update on that, Todd, as far as are they experiencing some big boom in recreation finally along the Elwha River?
Well, I looked at that. It's been a little while since I've looked at that, but that was one of the big selling points was that, now they're going to have this open river and you're going to get lots and lots of people going. And it's going to create whatever losses there are economically from removing the dams. You're going to make them up by increased recreation. So the U.S., the federal government, Park Service has a station. So I looked at visits based on the station. And right after, I think the first dam was removed, maybe it was first or second, I can't remember. There was a big spike in 1 month Boom, number of visitors. And then it went back down to normal. And then it went basically to zero because now that the river is not contained, it washed out the road. So the opportunity for people to recreate and get to it was zero because the road was washed out. So I haven't looked at the numbers in a while, but even before the road was washed out, the visitation levels were basically the same as they were before. There was no increase that you could see, and of course, once the road was washed out, it went down basically to zero. So again, yeah, they always promise. Oh, it is a very common thing to say if you destroy the economic value of forests, rivers, whatever, recreation will make it up. And it never works out. I mean, I remember when I was at the Department of Natural Resources, environmental groups would say, oh, if you stop harvesting in this area and turn it into a reserve, you're going to see an increase in recreation. So I remember I was visiting Omak in Okanagan County, near where a forest had been set aside as a natural resource conservation area. And so I was in the only hotel in Omak, and I said, so, are you seasonal? Tell me what you see. And she said, oh, yeah, we're a little bit seasonal, but not too much. I said, who do you get? Do you get a lot of people coming here to recreate? She goes, no, it's salespeople. That's who stays with us. So, she was not seeing a flood of people going to recreate in this newly preserved forest, but it is always the false promise that is made to say, don't worry, your economy will actually be better if we lock up this timber or destroy dams or do things like that.
Real quickly, before I let you go, you also posted a blog, I think it was October 9th or so, about yet another letter from the Department of Ecology and the denial, the continuously evolving denial of the impact on fuel prices from the cap and trade tax by the Inslee administration. I wondered if you could just update us on that latest letter.
Yeah. I'm really tired of writing about all of the nonsense from the Department of Ecology and the Inslee administration on the price of gasoline. It's very simple. You increase the taxes on gasoline, prices will go up. You can argue, you can quibble about, down to the penny how much they will go up, but prices will go up. The governor, when he signed the legislation, said, don't believe any of that swill that it's going to increase prices. That's just a lie. He knew it was going to increase prices. Everybody knew it was going to increase prices. But since that is the administration's position, they have to maintain the lie. So a year ago, the Department of Ecology wrote a letter to the legislature saying that prices would increase 5 cents a gallon. And bizarrely, even more bizarrely, although we focused on the gas prices, even more bizarrely, they claimed that natural gas prices would go down. Now, how you raise taxes on something and cause prices to go down, I still don't understand, but they put it in writing, which just shows you how completely out of touch the Department of Ecology is with reality and the reality of the impacts of their own policies. So we're a year later. So Senator Short, who wrote the original letter, wrote a follow-up letter saying, okay, you wrote this letter last year. We now have actual data and experience. Do you stand by what you wrote last year? And I went through the letter and compared the new letter to the old letter, but it is, there's a lot of backpedaling, a lot of game playing. Whereas last year they said that $41 a metric ton, which assumed that we were connected with Quebec and California in a larger market, was the most reliable, that was the most accurate. They now say, well, we gave a variety of numbers. It wasn't really just one. Whereas the original letter literally said, this is the number, it is the most reliable and accurate. So now they're backpedaling from that. They play a lot of games. But, one of the other arguments they make is, well, the numbers really haven't been right now, but in the long run, we are still confident in our predictions. So they have once again shown that they were impervious to data. The last thing is that they say, oh, no, these numbers weren't about 2023. They were about, 2030. Well, it's completely false. The question was, what are the prices going to be in 2023? And that was how they answered. But now that those numbers have been totally wrong, they're like, no, we were looking down the road. So there's just a lot of dishonesty, a lot of game playing. One of the favorite arguments that they now like to make is, look, prices go up and down without us. And in fact, gas prices are lower today than they were a year ago. Well, of course, there's lots of things that impact gas prices. And so the argument that says, hey, we didn't cause gas prices to go up, we just poured gasoline on the fire, I don't think is a very good argument. So yes, there are other things. They just made a bad situation worse. And they still are not able to admit that. So, like I said, I am tired of writing about the latest nonsense from the Department of Ecology and the Inslee administration, but we're going to keep writing about it because the cost is real. And until the governor, his administration, and legislators recognize that our economy, that families are suffering, that farmers are still suffering, even though they were supposed to be exempted from it, we're going to keep writing about it because they can't ignore it. They're doing harm. And the fact that they are dismissing the harm so that they can maintain fealty to their own ideology is just irresponsible. They are public servants. They're supposed to be working for us. And their whole strategy in these letters is to lie as fast as they can so the public doesn't catch up. So usually I give people the benefit of the doubt. In this one, they have lost all benefit of the doubt because they have changed their story so many times. It is very clear that they know that they are being intentionally dishonest. And it is frustrating. And I just say it, like I said, I think it's unethical and irresponsible.
You need to start thinking of yourself like a really popular comedian or a musician who has to sing that same song over and over again. You're like a Journey singing "Don't Stop Believing" for the 10 billionth time. You just got to keep going because it's the hit. And
Yes.
people want to
Well,
know.
it's if the Department of Ecology is going to keep, saying the same nonsense, I'm going to keep pointing out why it's wrong. So
Hey, you know what? I picked just the right song for that. Don't stop believing. I mean,
that's
that's what they want too. Please don't stop believing us, no matter how many times we lie to you. So good stuff, Todd. Thanks so much for coming on again today. Appreciate it.
yeah, good to see you.
You bet. All right, let's go to Chris Corry. He is our Center for Government Reform Director, and he has an update on the income tax on capital gains, where Washington Policy Center filed an amicus brief in that case. Chris, you want to give us kind of an outline of where the case is and what the case is about before we get into what our brief says?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. And similar to Todd, these gifts just keep on giving. We have been at the forefront of this capital gains tax fight from the very beginning. And no doubt people listening today have remembered us trying to fight it all the way through and support maintaining Washington's competitive advantage in the Quinn case. That case has been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. As for background, the Quinn case basically said that this income tax is unconstitutional. The Washington State Supreme Court, in a 7-2 ruling that was filled with a lot of mumbo jumbo, said it was. And so now the Freedom Foundation has appealed that decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Washington Policy Center has joined with the Opportunity for All coalition to file an amicus brief in support of having the U.S. Supreme Court hear that case and hopefully overturn this bad tax law.
And what are we basically saying to the court? What's our position?
So fundamentally, we are supporting the Freedom Foundation's arguments and saying a couple different things. One, that we believe that there's a constitutional limit on interstate taxes and that this tax clearly violates that by attacking or by taxing, excuse me, out-of-state transactions that have no connection to Washington, with the exception of the domicile of the property holder. So, for example, in the underlying WACs that are being proposed, there's an example given of a Washington resident who has, let's say, a coin collection, and they happen to go to Nevada and they sell that coin collection. Well, that transaction happens entirely within the state of Nevada. But according to the Department of Revenue, the state is allowed to collect an excise tax on that transaction because the domicile of the owner was Washington State. Now, if we were talking about a true capital gains income tax, that would be correct. There's a longstanding tradition and case law that says, income can be taxed in the home state, minus any sort of jurisdictional issues. But because we're calling this an excise tax, we're actually saying we're not taxing the income, we're taxing the transaction. That's where we're running into a constitutional limitation with the Commerce Clause. We believe that this obviously completely undermines the principles of federalism, and that states shouldn't be able to go into neighboring states and charge taxes. One of the examples that was in the brief filed by the Freedom Foundation and that I talked about was the idea of a Disneyland tax, where Washington decides it's going to charge a tax on any of its residents that visit Disneyland and force Disneyland to collect that 7% tax. Obviously, we all laugh at that idea because it's so implausible. But essentially, what we're saying here and what we're doing here is setting that example up. And it's not going to take too long for another state, if this stands and we don't challenge this now, to say, okay, I'm going to start taxing, what my residents do in another state because we don't like X, Y, or Z. And obviously, that creates a whole host of problems for citizens and businesses trying to do business in America.
It's a strange overreach too, because they didn't have to go that far. I mean, they could have exempted the transactions that were out of the income that was generated from transactions out of the state, because obviously, our state Supreme Court had this bizarre, convoluted attempt at redefining what a transactional tax was, but they could have excluded this income to avoid this challenge. Am I right there, or am I misreading it?
That's correct. If they would have kept this excise, this transactional tax, only within Washington's borders, I don't think there would be a Commerce Clause violation or a reason to appeal it up to the Supreme Court. But fundamentally, what we're doing is now transacting excise taxes on everything that an individual connected to Washington may do, whether it's property, any good subject to a capital gains tax, essentially.
Does this put the entire law into jeopardy, or only the portion of the law that deals with other states, or is that one of those things that we just have to wait and see for?
I think we're going to have to wait and see. I think that I personally believe that they have redefined what an excise tax is, and that should be struck down on its own. It could be limited to just taxes for transactions out of the state, or it could be the entire thing. I mean, there's a couple steps that we want to get through. First, we want to make sure, and the reason why we filed this amicus brief along with Opportunity for All Coalition and other very well-known national groups and state groups, is we want this case to be heard. And right now, there's no guarantee that the Supreme Court picks it up, which is why we were sharing our arguments and why we believe that the Supreme Court has a vested interest in doing that for protecting states and transactions across state lines. So that's the first step. And then from there, we'll get to see what the arguments look like if it is heard by the court.
Anything I've missed on this issue, Chris, that you want people to know on
the
amicus brief?
I think fundamentally when we're having these conversations, we need to remember why we're in this situation and why it's so important, because our state constitution limits uniform taxes on property, and we have historically in our state defined income as property. Now, one of the hopes of the majority party when this was passed was that the Supreme Court, the Washington State Supreme Court, would overturn that idea that income is property. And I know a lot of people listening into this webinar are probably scratching their heads going, income is property, it's mine. But because of that limitation, the Constitution doesn't allow a progressive income tax, which is what people in Olympia have been advocating for. So mind you, this whole situation, this whole excise tax mess we're in, is because the people in Olympia won't do a uniform income tax and are unwilling to ask the people again whether or not they want an income tax by changing the Constitution, because roundly and decidedly over and over and over, the citizens of Washington state have said no to an income tax.
Yeah, I think that's key. And then, the whole definition of property, all things tangible or intangible, so this idea, it doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't have to be dirt. It's ingrained in our state constitution and Washington state law and precedent. And suddenly, it's thrown out as though, we can do anything and call it a transaction. It was a bizarre and embarrassing ruling. And I think a lot of the criticism of it nationwide focused on the absurdities of it. Chris, I know you've got another interview coming up. And go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add is the one thing to remember is that not only had this not even barely been settled by the state Supreme Court, that a new bill was introduced to charge an excise tax on certain hospital employees' compensation. So if you think it stops with capital gains, if this is allowed to stand, we'll all have excise taxes on our direct deposits.
Yeah, and that's because it's what was the phrase? Excess income or excess salary or something.
Yes.
Because they get to define that.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's crazy, and the state looks at these things. It's like they looked at the oil company and were trying to point fingers on the cap and trade tax impact and claim it was all oil company greed, and then they missed the part where the state collects more money from every gallon of oil than the oil companies do, even using their false data. It was just ridiculous. All right, thanks, Chris. I know you have another interview coming up. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose, Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. We'll have this posted on our YouTube channel, usually within a day or two. So if you see something you like, you can share it with friends and let them know. The events are free every other week, and then during the legislative session, because there's so much going on, we're every week during the legislative session. But thank you for tuning in and spending your lunchtime with us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.